On the morning of December 17, 1944, a jeep carrying 3 American soldiers approached a checkpoint near the Belgian town of Weiler. The military policeman manning the position had been on edge for hours. Reports were flooding in about German commandos dressed as American GIs, slipping through the lines, causing havoc. These weren't just rumours anymore. The Battle of the Bulge had exploded across the Ardennes just the day before, and now word was spreading that Otto Skorzeny, the most dangerous man in Europe, had sent his men deep behind Allied lines wearing American uniforms. The MPs flagged down the jeep. The 3 men inside wore olive-drab fatigues with proper American insignia. They carried American weapons. Their vehicle had American markings, but something felt off. When challenged for the password, they fumbled. Their English, though passable, carried a strange accent. The MPs ordered them out of the vehicle at gunpoint. A quick search revealed what they'd suspected. Under the American uniforms were German field grey tunics. In their pockets, Wehrmacht pay books. And hidden in the jeep, along with 2 British Sten guns, was $900 in American currency and £1,000 sterling. The 3 Americans were actually Unteroffizier Manfred Panas, Oberfahnrich Günther Billing, and Gefreiter Wilhelm Schmidt of Panzer Brigade 150. They were part of Operation Greif, and they'd just been caught. The capture of these 3 men would set off one of the most bizarre episodes of World War II. Within days, the entire Allied rear area would be gripped by paranoia. Checkpoints would spring up everywhere. American soldiers would be stopping other American soldiers, grilling them with questions about baseball scores and Mickey Mouse's girlfriend. A 4-star general would be detained because he correctly identified the capital of Illinois. Another general would be held for 5 hours because he didn't know which league the Chicago Cubs played in. And Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower himself would become a virtual prisoner in his own headquarters, surrounded by guards convinced that German commandos were coming to kill him. All because of one Austrian SS officer's audacious plan to send English-speaking Germans behind enemy lines dressed as Americans. But this story begins weeks earlier, in October 1944, at Adolf Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia. The war was going badly for Germany. The Allies had liberated Paris. They were pushing toward the German border. The Soviets were crushing Army Group Center in the east. Hitler needed a miracle, and he thought he'd found it in one last desperate offensive through the Ardennes. The plan was ambitious, perhaps insanely so. German forces would punch through the thinly held American lines in the Ardennes forest, drive northwest to the Meuse River, cross it, then race to Antwerp. If successful, they'd split the British and American armies in 2, capture the vital port that supplied the Allied war machine, and maybe, just maybe, force the Western Allies to negotiate a peace. The offensive needed every advantage. Speed was critical. If the Germans could reach the Meuse bridges before the Americans destroyed them, their armour could cross quickly and the plan might work. But if those bridges went down, the attack would stall, giving the Allies time to bring up reinforcements. Hitler needed someone who could seize those bridges by any means necessary. He needed Otto Skorzeny. Otto Skorzeny was already a legend. At 6'4" with a massive dueling scar across his left cheek, he looked like something out of a propaganda poster. But more than his appearance, it was his audacity that had earned him fame. In September 1943, he'd led a glider assault on a mountaintop hotel in the Gran Sasso Mountains of Italy, rescuing Benito Mussolini from captivity in what became one of the war's most daring commando raids. More recently, in Operation Panzerfaust, he'd helped orchestrate the kidnapping of Hungarian Regent Miklos Horthy Jr., forcing the regent's resignation and keeping Hungary in the war. Hitler loved him. The Allies feared him. He was perfect for what Hitler had in mind. On October 22, 1944, Skorzeny was summoned to Hitler's headquarters at Rastenburg. After congratulations and a promotion, Hitler outlined the Ardennes offensive and Skorzeny's role. Skorzeny would form a new brigade, Panzer Brigade 150, and equip it with captured American vehicles and uniforms. English-speaking German soldiers would don these disguises and slip behind American lines. Their primary mission was to capture at least 2 of the bridges over the Meuse River, intact before American engineers could blow them. Their secondary mission was to spread chaos, confusion, and terror in the Allied rear. They would cut telephone lines, change road signs, misdirect traffic, spread false rumours, give fake orders. They would make the Americans see enemies everywhere. Hitler gave Skorzeny unlimited authority and 5 weeks to prepare. Skorzeny immediately sent out a call throughout the Wehrmacht for volunteers who spoke English, preferably with an American accent. The response was disappointing. Only about 10 men spoke English well enough to pass as native speakers. Most volunteers had rudimentary English at best, learned in school or from brief stays in English-speaking countries before the war. Some had such thick accents that Skorzeny wondered how they'd ever fool anyone. One young Luftwaffe private named Fritz Christ thought he was volunteering to interrogate prisoners of war. Safely behind German lines, he and others like him were in for a rude awakening. The equipment situation was even worse. Skorzeny had requested 15 American tanks, 20 armoured cars, 20 self-propelled guns, 100 jeeps, 40 motorcycles, and 120 trucks. What he got was a hodgepodge of barely functional vehicles. Only 2 actual American Sherman tanks could be found. The rest had to be faked. German Panther tanks were crudely disguised with sheet metal to vaguely resemble American M10 tank destroyers, though Skorzeny admitted only very young American troops seeing them from very far away at night might be fooled. The jeeps were in better shape, but many of the uniforms were British or Polish. Some still had prisoner of war markings, and others were stained with blood. Despite the shortcomings, Skorzeny pressed on. His men were sent to a heavily guarded training camp at Grafenwöhr in eastern Bavaria. There they watched American movies to learn slang and accents. They studied American culture, American military organization, American habits. They practiced their cover stories. Those who spoke the best English were organized into small commando teams called Einheit Stielau, named after their commander. These teams, usually 3 to 6 men each, would be the ones to actually infiltrate American lines. The rest of Panzer Brigade 150 would follow behind in their disguised vehicles, ready to exploit any success the commandos had achieved. The secrecy was supposed to be absolute. Every volunteer signed a pledge that breach of security was punishable by death. But Hitler's headquarters made a catastrophic error. On October 25th, the Wehrmacht High Command issued an order to every unit on the Western Front requesting English-speaking volunteers for special operations. The order was headed Secret Commando Operations and bore the signature of Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel. It might as well have been broadcast on the radio. Within days, Allied intelligence had intercepted reports of this mysterious call for English speakers. By the end of November, the Allies knew something was coming, though they had no idea what. Skorzeny tried to cancel the operation, knowing the element of surprise was compromised. Hitler refused. The offensive would go ahead as planned, so Skorzeny adjusted. If the Allies knew Germans might be operating behind their lines, fine. Let them know. Let the paranoia work for Germany. Even if his commandos accomplished nothing, the fear and confusion they caused might be worth as much as blowing a bridge. On December 14th, Panzer Brigade 150 assembled near Bad Münstereifel on the German side of the border. The Einheit Stielau commando teams received their final briefings. They were divided into 3 types. Lead squads would move just ahead of the main German armoured spearheads, spreading confusion and giving false orders to American units they encountered. Reconnaissance squads would push as far west as possible, gather intelligence on American positions near the Meuse, and sow chaos wherever they could. Demolition squads would blow up fuel dumps, ammunition stores, and any bridges the Germans didn't need. In the early hours of December 16th, the Ardennes offensive began. Over 250,000 German troops, supported by nearly 1,000 tanks and assault guns, smashed into the thinly held American positions. The shock was total. Green American divisions, sent to this quiet sector for rest and training, suddenly found themselves facing elite SS panzer divisions and battle-hardened paratroopers. Some units fought bravely, others broke and ran, confusion reigned, and in the midst of this chaos, Skorzeny's commandos slipped across the lines. According to Skorzeny's later accounts, 44 men in American uniforms successfully infiltrated Allied territory in the first few days. Their achievements, such as they were, came in fits and starts. One team reportedly prevented the demolition of a bridge at Stavelot, allowing SS Panzer Commander Joachim Peiper's armoured column to cross. Another team misdirected an entire American convoy of armour and supplies down the wrong road, sending them away from the fighting. A member of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion reported that Germans had changed road signs at Montreuil on December 17th. One team supposedly redirected American reinforcements heading toward the front, sending this in circles. But the real damage wasn't in what Skorzeny's men actually did, it was in what the Americans thought they might do. On December 18th, Manfred Pernass, Gunther Billing and Wilhelm Schmidt were captured at Eiweiler. Under interrogation, Schmidt made a fateful statement. He said their mission was part of Operation Greif, and that Skorzeny's ultimate objective was to infiltrate the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force in Paris or Versailles, and capture or assassinate General Dwight Eisenhower himself. It's unclear if Schmidt actually believed this or if he was deliberately spreading disinformation. Skorzeny later insisted no such mission existed, that the story was merely a rumour he'd encouraged among his men to boost morale, never expecting anyone to take it seriously, but the Americans took it very seriously indeed. A captured document outlining Operation Greif's deception tactics had already been found near Heckenscheid. Skorzeny's reputation preceded him. This was the man who'd snatched Mussolini from a mountaintop fortress. If anyone could slip into Allied headquarters undetected, it was Skorzeny. The security response was immediate and overwhelming. Eisenhower's headquarters at Versailles became a fortress. Guards were tripled, vehicle checks intensified. Eisenhower himself was essentially placed under house arrest. For several days he was confined to his office, unable to move freely, surrounded by nervous guards scanning every face for potential assassins. According to reports, Eisenhower was unamused. After several days of this confinement, he finally stormed out, declaring he had to get out and didn't care if anyone tried to kill him. A decoy, Lieutenant Colonel Baldwin Smith, who bore a resemblance to Eisenhower, was used to drive between the general's quarters and headquarters each day, drawing potential attackers away from the real Supreme Commander. But the paranoia spread far beyond Eisenhower's headquarters. Checkpoints sprouted like mushrooms across the entire Allied rear. American military police, suddenly tasked with identifying potential German infiltrators, came up with an ingenious if imperfect solution. They would ask questions that only a real American would know. What's the capital of Illinois? Who won the World Series? What league are the Chicago Cubs in? Who's Mickey Mouse's girlfriend? Name the positions on a football line of scrimmage. Who's married to Betty Grable? The logic was simple. A German commando, no matter how well trained in English, couldn't possibly master every detail of American popular culture, American geography, American sports. These questions became shibboleths, tests of authenticity administered at gunpoint to thousands of soldiers, many of whom had no idea why they were suddenly being quizzed about baseball. The results were often farcical. On December 17th, General Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group, was stopped 3 times at different checkpoints. At one, he was asked to identify the capital of Illinois. Bradley correctly answered Springfield. The military policeman who'd asked the question briefly detained him, insisting the capital was Chicago. At another checkpoint, Bradley was asked to identify the position of the guard on a football offensive line, between the center and the tackle. He answered correctly. At a third stop, he was grilled about Betty Grable's husband, band leader Harry James. Bradley later recalled the incidents with amusement, but at the time it wasn't funny. Here was one of the Army's senior commanders, delayed in his movements during a critical battle because overzealous MPs didn't know basic American geography. Brigadier General Bruce Clark of the 7th Armoured Division had it worse. Clark was one of the unsung heroes of the Battle of the Bulge. His Combat Command B would conduct a brilliant mobile defence of the town of St. Vith, buying critical time for the Allies to organise their response to the German offensive. But on December 20th, as he rushed around organising his defences, Clark was stopped at a checkpoint. The MPs demanded he prove his identity. Someone asked which league the Chicago Cubs played in. Clark, whose expertise was armour tactics, not baseball, answered the American League. The Cubs, of course, play in the National League. The MPs, convinced they caught a German spy, arrested the general and locked him in a nearby house. For 5 hours, Clark sat there, fuming, unable to do the vital work of organising the defence while his captors congratulated themselves on catching an infiltrator. It took that long for someone to arrive who could positively identify Clark and get him released. The British weren't immune either. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's Jeep was stopped by trigger-happy American soldiers who shot out its tyres, presumably because Montgomery's British uniform and accent seemed suspicious. American correspondent came through a checkpoint and when asked about state capitals, said Baltimore was the capital of Maryland instead of Annapolis. He was waved through before he could correct himself, the guards apparently equally confused about American geography. Meanwhile, the actual German infiltrators were finding their mission nearly impossible. The few who spoke perfect English had some success. One team drove right into an American-held town, scouted the defences, and drove out without being challenged. But most of the commandos' English simply wasn't good enough. Their accents gave them away. The unfamiliarity with American slang betrayed them. Their ignorance of American culture was a fatal flaw. One team was reportedly caught near Poteau on December 18th after referring to E Company of a cavalry unit. An actual American soldier would have said E Troop, as cavalry units used troops, not companies. The Germans didn't know this small detail, and it cost them their lives. The psychological impact, however, was everything Skorzeny could have hoped for. General George Patton, commanding the Third Army, was alarmed enough to describe the situation to Eisenhower on December 17th. His words captured the mood perfectly. Kraut speaking perfect English, he said, raising hell, cutting wires, turning road signs around, spooking whole divisions, and shoving a bulge into the defences. The whole Allied rear area was looking over its shoulder. Soldiers were suspicious of everyone. Traffic slowed to a crawl as checkpoints backed up for miles. Units wasted time and energy checking and rechecking identities. Resources were diverted to guard against infiltrators who, in reality, posed minimal actual threat. This was psychological warfare at its finest. Skorzeny had perhaps 44 men successfully operating behind Allied lines, yet he'd made 500,000 Allied soldiers believe German commandos could be anywhere, could be anyone. The irony is that the more spectacular rumours, like the plot to assassinate Eisenhower, were almost certainly false. But they served Skorzeny's purposes perfectly. Every hour Allied commanders spent worrying about infiltrators was an hour they weren't spending coordinating their response to the real German offensive. The actual accomplishments of Operation Greif were modest at best. The primary objective, seizing bridges over the Meuse, was never achieved. By December 17th, when the lead German armoured units were supposed to be approaching the river, they were still stuck miles to the east, bogged down by fierce American resistance at places like Elsenborn Ridge and St. Vith, by traffic jams on the narrow Ardennes roads, by fuel shortages, and by weather that initially grounded Allied air power but also turned roads to mud. Skorzeny realised the operation had failed in its primary aim. On December 17th, he attended a staff conference and recommended his brigade be used as a conventional combat unit instead of continuing the infiltration mission. On December 21st, Panzer Brigade 150, still in its hodgepodge of American and disguised German vehicles, attempted to assault the town of Malmedy. The attack was a disaster. American defenders, alert and dug in, repelled several assaults. Skorzeny's unit, trained for deception and infiltration, proved inadequate as a frontline combat formation. The attack cost them dearly and achieved nothing. By late December, the last of the disguised commandos still operating behind American lines were ordered to withdraw. Most had already been captured. 17 German soldiers caught wearing American uniforms were tried by military commission between December the 21st and the end of the month. Manfred Pernass, Günther Billing, and Wilhelm Schmidt were tried at Henri-Chapelle on December 21st. They were sentenced to death. On the morning of December 23rd, just 2 days before Christmas, they were taken to an execution site. A medic pinned white paper targets over their hearts. They were blindfolded and tied to posts. According to witnesses, Wilhelm Schmidt's glasses were removed before the firing squad took aim. Günther Billing, defiant to the end, shouted, "Long live our Führer Adolf Hitler" at the moment of execution. The firing squad, composed of 24 men, fired. All 3 Germans slumped dead against their posts. Over the following days and into early January, 13 more captured infiltrators were executed at Henri-Chapelle or Huy. The executions were conducted under the authority of the Hague Convention of 1907, which explicitly prohibited combatants from wearing enemy uniforms in combat. The legal reasoning was clear. These men had been caught behind enemy lines, in American uniforms, engaged in military operations. They had forfeited their rights as prisoners of war. The sentences were reviewed and approved up the chain of command, from Colonel E.M. Brannan of the Staff Judge Advocate to Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges commanding the 1st U.S. Army to General Omar Bradley commanding 12th Army Group, acting on verbal instructions from Eisenhower himself. The executions were controversial even then. The captured Germans argued they'd never actually fought while wearing American uniforms, that they'd been instructed to remove the disguises before engaging in combat, making their actions a legitimate ruse de guerre under international law. But the Allied military commissions weren't swayed. The men had been caught in enemy uniforms behind enemy lines. That was enough. Otto Skorzeny himself wouldn't face justice until after the war. He surrendered to the 30th Infantry Regiment in May 1945. For 2 years he sat in prison awaiting trial. Finally, in August 1947, Skorzeny and 9 other officers from Panzer Brigade 150 stood before an American military tribunal at Dachau. They faced charges of improperly using American military insignia, theft of American uniforms, and theft of Red Cross parcels from American prisoners of war. The trial lasted over 3 weeks. The Red Cross parcels charge was dropped for lack of evidence. Skorzeny's defense focused on a key distinction. Yes, his men had worn American uniforms behind enemy lines. Yes, they'd engaged in deception and sabotage, but they'd been ordered to remove the American uniforms before engaging in actual combat. That made their actions a legitimate ruse de guerre, not a war crime. On the final day of the trial, September 9, 1947, an unexpected witness appeared for the defense. FFE Yo Thomas was a former British Special Operations executive agent who'd operated behind German lines during the war. He testified that the Western Allies had contemplated and in some cases carried out similar operations, using German uniforms for infiltration missions. If Skorzeny and his men were guilty, Yo Thomas argued, then British and American Special Forces operatives who'd done essentially the same thing were equally guilty. The tribunal acquitted all defendants. The verdict established a legal precedent that would clarify international law for decades. Wearing enemy uniforms for infiltration and deception was permissible under the laws of war, as long as the uniforms were removed before engaging in combat. Skorzeny's men who'd been caught and executed had died not because they wore American uniforms, but because they were caught wearing them while actively engaged in military operations behind enemy lines. Skorzeny didn't stay imprisoned long after his acquittal. In July 1948, he escaped from an internment camp with the help of former SS comrades. He fled through Germany to Austria, then to France, and eventually to Spain, where he lived openly under the protection of Francisco Franco's government. He became a businessman, allegedly worked as a military advisor to Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser, and lived comfortably until his death in Madrid on July 5, 1975, at age 67. He never faced consequences for Operation Greif beyond the time spent awaiting trial. The Battle of the Bulge itself dragged on into January 1945. The German offensive, which had seemed so terrifying in those first days of December, gradually ground to a halt. American forces held at critical points like Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne Division's defense became legendary, and Saint-Vith, where Bruce Clark's mobile defense bought crucial time. By late December, the weather cleared enough for Allied air superiority to assert itself. Thousands of sorties pounded German columns, destroying tanks and trucks by the hundreds. On December 26th, George Patton's Third Army broke through to relieve Bastogne. By January 25, 1945, the Germans had been pushed back to their starting positions. The offensive had failed. Operation Greif, measured purely by its stated objectives, was a failure. The Meuse bridges were never captured. The infiltration teams accomplished little of military significance. Panzer Brigade 150 proved ineffective as a combat unit. But measured by its psychological impact, Operation Greif was perhaps more successful than Skorzeny could have imagined. For weeks, the entire Allied rear area was paralysed by fear and suspicion. Commanders were delayed, traffic was disrupted, resources were diverted, all because of rumours, fear, and a handful of German soldiers in American uniforms. The lessons learned went beyond the immediate tactical situation. After the Battle of the Bulge, Allied forces became far more conscious of security. the simple expedient of asking culture-specific questions became standard practice for verifying identities. The American military developed more sophisticated systems of passwords, countersigns, and verification procedures. The ease with which Skorzeny's operation had sown paranoia taught Allied commanders that psychological warfare could be as dangerous as tanks and artillery. There's a deeper lesson too about the nature of deception in warfare. Skorzeny understood something fundamental. In war, perception matters as much as reality. It doesn't matter if you can't actually assassinate the enemy commander, if you can make him believe his life is in danger. It doesn't matter if you can't actually infiltrate every unit, if you can make every unit believe infiltrators are present. Fear and uncertainty are weapons as potent as any explosive. 44 men caused more disruption to Allied operations than hundreds of conventional soldiers might have managed. The story of Operation Greif and the American response resonates because it reveals the fog of war in microcosm. In the chaos of combat, certainty becomes precious and rare. How do you know who to trust? How do you distinguish friend from enemy when the enemy is wearing your uniform and speaking your language? The Americans' solution, asking questions about baseball and Mickey Mouse, seems almost comical in retrospect. Yet it worked, more or less. It gave frightened soldiers a tool, however imperfect, to impose order on chaos. The men who died for Operation Greif, executed by firing squads in the frozen Belgian winter, were pawns in a larger game. Manfred Pernas was 23 years old when he died. Gunther Billing was 21. Wilhelm Schmidt was 24. They'd volunteered for what they thought would be an exciting special mission, perhaps imagining glory and adventure. Instead, they found themselves tied to posts with paper targets pinned to their chests, facing a firing squad of enemies who looked and spoke remarkably like the men they'd been pretending to be. The irony must have been bitter in those final moments. Their graves lie in the German military cemetery at Lommel in Belgium, one of the largest German war cemeteries in Western Europe with nearly 39,000 graves. Pernas, Billing and Schmidt are buried side by side, their names on simple stone markers, remembered now mainly as footnotes to a failed operation in a lost war. The cemetery is quiet, peaceful, a place for reflection on the waste and tragedy of war. Visitors who know the story might pause at those three graves and consider the strange circumstances that brought these young men to their deaths, caught between the demands of duty, the fog of war, and the unforgiving logic of military law. The Americans who pulled checkpoint duty during those paranoid weeks in December and January, asking their own countrymen questions about state capitals and baseball, probably found the experience surreal. Imagine stopping a jeep full of soldiers who look exactly like you, sound exactly like you, and being tasked with determining through a handful of trivia questions whether they're genuine or enemy agents. The pressure must have been intense. Get it wrong and you might let German commandos through, but be too zealous and you might detain or even shoot your own officers, as nearly happened with Bradley and Clark. There was no good solution, only improvisation and hope. For Otto Skorzeny, Operation Greif became another chapter in his legend. Even though it failed in its primary objectives, his reputation as a daring commando earned in earlier operations remained intact. The operation's psychological success, such as it was, burnished his image as a master of unconventional warfare. In his post-war memoirs and interviews, he spoke of Operation Greif with a mixture of pride and pragmatism, acknowledging its limitations while claiming credit for the chaos it caused. Whether he actually believed the operation significantly impacted the Battle of the Bulge, or merely enjoyed his reputation is unclear. What's certain is that Operation Greif remained one of the most talked about special operations of the war, studied in military academies and debated by historians for decades after. The Battle of the Bulge itself stands as the largest and bloodiest battle fought by the United States Army in World War II. American casualties totaled over 80,000 killed, wounded, or captured. German casualties exceeded 100,000. The battle marked the last major German offensive of the war. After the Bulge, Germany was on the defensive everywhere, its armies bleeding and exhausted, its industry being pounded to rubble by Allied bombers, its cities being overrun by Soviet and Western Allied forces. Victory in Europe would come less than 5 months after the Bulge ended, with Germany's unconditional surrender on May 7, 1945. In that broader context, Operation Greif was a sideshow, a minor episode in a massive battle that was itself part of a continental war. Yet it captures the imagination precisely because it was so unusual, so audacious, and so deeply unsettling to those who experienced it. The idea of the enemy infiltrating your lines, wearing your uniform, speaking your language, sowing confusion from within, strikes at a primal fear. It's the nightmare scenario that every army worries about, the fifth column, the enemy within, indistinguishable from your own soldiers until the moment they strike. That the Americans responded with questions about baseball and state capitals now seems almost endearing in its Americanness. What could be more American than assuming everyone should know who plays center field for the Yankees or what state Springfield is the capital of? The questions reveal assumptions about shared culture, shared knowledge, shared identity that transcend mere military organization. To be American, these questions implied, meant knowing certain things, caring about certain things, having certain cultural touchstones in common. A German, no matter how perfect his English, would lack these touchstones. He might fool the ear, but he couldn't fool a question about Betty Grable's husband or the World Series. The strategy worked, mostly. German infiltrators were caught. American paranoia, while excessive, did help identify genuine threats. But the friendly fire incidents, the delayed commanders, the hours wasted at checkpoints, all demonstrated the costs of that paranoia. Security and efficiency exist in tension. The tighter your security, the less efficient your operations. The Americans erred on the side of security during the Bulge, perhaps rightly so given the stakes. Looking back 80 years later, Operation Greif seems like something from a different era of warfare. In an age of precision-guided munitions, satellite surveillance, and digital communications, the idea of sending men in disguise to change road signs and spread rumours seems quaintly obsolete. Modern militaries would accomplish the same goals with the electronic warfare, cyber attacks, and information operations conducted from thousands of miles away. Yet the underlying principle remains unchanged. War is as much about the enemy's mind as about his material strength. Make him uncertain, make him afraid, make him see threats everywhere, and you degrade his effectiveness without firing a shot. Perhaps that's why Operation Greif still resonates. It reminds us that war, for all its technological sophistication, remains a fundamentally human endeavour. It's fought by people who feel fear, who make mistakes, who can be deceived and confused. Otto Skorzeny understood this. He knew he didn't have the resources to actually seize the Meuse bridges or really assassinate Eisenhower, but he knew he could make the Allies believe these things might happen, and that belief would have consequences. The story of Operation Greif is ultimately a story about the power of perception in warfare. 44 men in stolen uniforms caused more disruption than thousands might have achieved through conventional means. 3 captured soldiers, through one false confession about assassinating Eisenhower, locked down the entire Allied command structure for days. Road signs turned the wrong way, and false rumours sent whole units in circles. And American soldiers, confronted with an enemy that looked just like them, responded with the most American thing imaginable, asking questions about baseball. It's a strange story, often darkly comic in its absurdities, tragic in its human costs, and enduringly fascinating in what it reveals about war, deception, and the fog of battle. The men who participated on both sides were caught up in forces beyond their control, trying to do their duty as they understood it, in circumstances that tested the limits of courage, ingenuity, and endurance. Some, like Panas, Billing, and Schmidt, paid with their lives. Others, like Bradley and Clark, survived to tell the tale with bemusement, and Otto Skorzeny escaped judgment entirely, dying peacefully decades later, his reputation as a commando intact, his role in one of the war's strangest operations secure in military history. The Battle of the Bulge ended in January 1945 with an Allied victory, though purchased at terrible cost. Operation Greif, a small part of that larger battle, failed in its objectives, but succeeded in creating chaos and fear far beyond its size. The American response, improvised and imperfect, worked well enough. The checkpoints, the questions, the paranoid security measures, all bought time and caught infiltrators. It was messy, inefficient, sometimes farcical, but ultimately effective. Just like democracy itself, Churchill might have said, it was the worst system except for all the others. and in December 1944, in the frozen Ardennes, with German panzers driving west and enemy soldiers infiltrating in American uniforms, messy and effective was good enough.